Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent with me, Benga Aborowa. This is the program where we bring you all the latest updates and security happenings around the continent of Africa. But before we delve into today's topic, let me first bring you the major security headlines. Nigeria's government urged to secure the release of the Abuja-Kaduna train kidnap victims. Police in Ghana have arrested 3 suspects over the public flogging of lovers in Upper West region of Wa. And the United Nations peacekeeper killed in terrorist attack in northern Mali. Lastly, the United Nations envoy urges a strong response against rebels in the Congo. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Now, on Secure the Continent today, our attention has been drawn to the growing insurgency in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where fighting occurred between the Congolese army and the M23 rebels in the most sustained offensive since the 2012-2013 insurrection that overtook the city of Goma, which has a population of over 1 million people. The Congolese government has accused neighboring Rwanda of supporting M23 rebels and asked regional monitors to investigate. We have more details for you in this package.
The eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo is famous for many reasons. It is a richly blessed part of Africa and with some of the world's most sought-after mineral resources. As blessed as this region is, it is also one of the most insecure parts of Africa. Ongoing clashes in the Rutshuru territory between the DR Congo's armed forces and the notorious group of fighters known as the M23 have led to the displacement of more than 75,000 people. Renewed fighting in the region has brought back the painful memories of the violence experienced in the not-too-distant past. As of May 30th, 2022, the violence that has erupted again have forced more than 11,000 Congolese to flee across the border into neighboring Uganda. Congolese, Burundian and Ugandan armed forces are fighting against rebels wreaking havoc on the people. The fighting has centered around many issues. The role of the conflict minerals in the violence is highly debated. Some say that the illegal exploitation of minerals is the main cause of the ongoing violence. However, others challenge this interpretation, arguing that while conflict minerals are undoubtedly one of the many causes of violence in the region, they also are most likely not the most significant and impactful one. So what is the violence in the region about? What stakes do Rwanda and Uganda have in the conflict? What does the conflict mean to the larger African Great Lake region? And what holds the key to the peace of the region? For the DR Congo's strategic position in Africa and for the future of the continent, the focus is on Africa's 4th most populous country today, as it is important in securing the continent.
Now, joining me to discuss the implication of this are Declan Galvin, head of Insight, Information and Intelligence at WS Insight. He joins us live from Nairobi, Kenya. Thanks for joining us, Declan. I also have Kambali Musavuli, an analyst and spokesperson for the Center for Research on the Congo-Kinshasa. He joins live from the Ghanaian capital, Accra. Good evening to you, Kambali. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on the program. I'd like to start with Declan. Now, for a few years now, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda have had a tumultuous relationship. Now, what's responsible for this latest strain in the relationship between both nations?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that the latest strain in relations is against a backdrop of really shifting geopolitics and then strategic politics and positioning within the Great Lakes region. What I mean specifically by that is we've seen a transition to a Tshisekedi administration, and Tshisekedi has been building stronger ties with neighbors. You'll no doubt be aware that DRC is now a member of the East African community. And so there has been a big diplomatic move by this administration to secure stronger ties with Uganda as well as with Burundi. That is, to a certain extent, alienating some interests in Eastern Congo with ties to Rwanda. And that has been one of the more strong forces behind kind of a falling out. We've been seeing in recent days accusations between Kinshasa and Kigali regarding one another threatening each other's security. And that's really where that's the story up until this week.
Thank you, Declan. I would like to bring in Kambali. Now, Kambali, the Congolese government is accusing the Rwandan government of backing the M23 rebels. And they've taken extraordinary measures. They've stopped Rwanda from flying to the DRC, and they've also summoned the ambassador of Rwanda to explain what is really going on. So is there any evidence to back the claims from Kinshasa that, Rwanda is responsible for sponsoring this M23 rebels?
I think the evidence that the Congolese government, specifically actually the Congolese military, has presented to the public is the weaponry that the M23 is using. Some of the locations where the M23 were dislodged as they ran from the attacks of the Congolese army and the UN forces, they recover weapons that are quite sophisticated, that they did not have before. And then beyond that is also the arrest. I don't know if I should call it arrest, but the population of the eastern part of DRC were able to catch 2 Rwandan soldiers 20 kilometers away from the border and turn them into the Congolese military. These soldiers, as we speak now, actually, they are being worked to be released as the Congolese government has agreed to return these 2 soldiers to Rwanda after meeting with the president of Angola. So the evidence has been presented. Beyond that, on the battlefield, their firepower has increased tremendously. They are able to fight at night and launch precise attacks against the Congolese military, showing that they also have night vision materials, which they did not have in the past. So looking at this element, that's what the military presented and said that Rwanda is tacitly again, 10 years later, supporting the M23 rebellion. What's the backdrop of this support? It's happening while the Congolese government is working in Kenya, in Nairobi precisely, to negotiate with rebels, right, for some type of peace negotiation so they could put down their guns. So you don't, in Nairobi, you don't have only the M23 negotiating with the Congolese government. You have many other rebel forces negotiating. In the midst of that, the M23 has launched an attack on the Congolese military with the evidence that I just presented that the Congolese government has shown. So it's really up to Rwanda and Rwanda to stop supporting rebel militias in the group, and also regional leaders and international leaders to stop this hypocrisy of not naming the force beyond rebels. I listened to the UN Security Council meeting, I think it was yesterday, and the day before yesterday. I mean, in that meeting, it was quite interesting that people will mention a negative force, an outside force supporting rebels. It's not a mysterious force supporting the rebels. We know the external force. So whenever we are very clear, if we can condemn Russia in saying that you are supporting Ukraine, why are we afraid to say Rwanda and hold Rwanda accountable to stop interfering in Congolese politics and destabilizing the DRC?
Thank you, Kambali. I'm glad you mentioned the Nairobi Peace Accords, but we'll get to that in the course of our conversation. Now, Declan, we've seen this on and off insurgency by the M23 in the past. The latest was in April of this year. Declan, why do we see a re-emergence of this attacks by the M23? What's responsible for this sudden attacks by M23?
So one of the reasons that analysts and members of the international community operating in Congo point to is the most recent incursion by the Ugandan People's Defense Force into Eastern Congo. As you'll recall, the Allied Democratic Forces, who have been operating in Eastern Congo for a number of years, recently conducted suicide attacks in Kampala. That prompted deeper military engagement by the Ugandan authorities, together with the Congolese military under what they call Operation Shuja. And that has brought in a range of other actors. And it looks like M23 has either on its own accord decided to become more involved, or if you read a number of reports by human rights observers, that it's receiving support from the Rwandan government. But nevertheless, I think the trigger of M23's most recent engagement has been the growing military activity by DRC's neighbors.
Yeah, but on invitation of DRC itself, we'll get to that in the course of the conversation. Now, Kambali, Rwanda's foreign minister said they will not be drawn into Congolese internal affairs, that the fighting is between the Congolese army and M23. They say it's an intra-Congolese conflict. How else has Rwanda responded to these accusations by Kinshasa? And what's your reaction to the statement by Rwanda's foreign minister?
I mean, I think they are on the defensive. You know, one time they will say that it's a inter-Congolese problem. We have to resolve it ourselves. In the other, they will say things such as, in the DRC, there are rebel groups called FDLR, and Rwanda, for its security interests, has to do everything in its power to make sure that this rebel force FDLR doesn't affect the security. Who are the FDLR? It's a Ragtag rebel group from Rwanda. Some of the forces within the FDLR participated in the genocide in Rwanda. And they've been in DRC since the Rwandan genocide. And now when you look at the forces, some of the soldiers are in their 20s. So you know that even the current soldiers were either not born or very young when the genocide happened. So that's what they use to say that this is the reason why they are there. The Congolese position is very clear on the FDLR. I mean, the FDLR in the DRC is a Rwandan problem. The FDLR have to return to Rwanda. So you see, for example...
But geographically, Kambali, all the skirmishes are happening within Congolese territory. So doesn't that make it a Congolese problem?
No, it's a proxy militia group. So the FDLR are Rwandans who are in the DRC. They must return to the country. One should ask, why aren't they returning in the country? Because we are in Nairobi right now where Congolese are being asked to negotiate with rebel forces. Why isn't Rwanda negotiating with their own rebels? Earlier, Mr. Devlin just mentioned the ADF. The ADF are Ugandan rebels. So Congolese are being asked to negotiate with Ugandan rebels. It's not our problem. Why isn't the Ugandan government negotiating with their own rebels to be able to find a peaceful solution to that? So for neighbor countries have exported their problem into our country and are now being asked the tough questions about they need to make sure the same process the Congolese are doing with the so-called rebels, that they should do the same. But what is not being spoken about when we speak about the issues of Rwanda and Uganda, if you look at the Ugandan government, the current president of Uganda has been in power since 1986. He's not interested in democratic processes. Anyone who's been there for over 30 years, is not interested in having a democratic change, a democratic process to deal with internal problems in the country. So ADF becomes a pretext to always have a military presence in DRC. Something for Rwanda. The president of Rwanda has been in power for over 2 decades. And it looks like he's not going to leave anytime soon, given he's changed the constitution to allow him to still stay for another 10 years at least. Now, it's predicted by 2036, that's when he may leave power. So for FDLR is the same. So as we keep saying that Congo has a problem, but the forces creating the problems are not Congolese, but we're not asking the countries where these problems are coming from to deal with their internal problem, to have an inter-Rwandan dialogue, allowing Rwandans to actually speak to one another to resolve the fundamental problem that created the Rwandan genocide. There's something in Uganda, to have Ugandans be able to choose their leader freely so that we don't have a dictator imposing everything in that country. That would be my response. It's not a Congolese problem. It's a Rwandan problem, Ugandan problem that has to be looked at regionally, but not be left as for us Congolese to solve it, because we did not commit a genocide in Rwanda and we did not commit a genocide in Uganda.
Thank you, Kambali. Now, Declan, back to M23. Now, after the first clashes in March and April of this year, the M23 declared multiple unilateral ceasefire. It's also announced it will lay down its arms for good. Then in April, it promised to withdraw from the areas it had occupied after fighting in late March and asked for a dialogue with the Congolese government. Why did this ceasefire not hold, and why are we in this situation today?
So the dynamics and economics around kind of militant activities and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs in general, which is a really important talking point when discussing M23. These are highly complex processes. And what we see, particularly with protracted militant struggles, very much like indicative of what we see in Eastern Congo, there's all sorts of incentive structures that get put into place for militant leadership to say, okay, we're ready to kind of lay down arms and begin processes of negotiation. And then they can kind of extend that negotiation, and then they use leverage by returning back to arms in order to try to perpetuate either kind of economic or political interests. That's very much kind of at the center of this. Certainly, if you look at it more long term as opposed to episodically over the last few months, we see that common thread. To be sure, though, and I think this is an important point to highlight, M23 and the issues and circumstances around it can be resolved diplomatically. And you can't always say that for all of these kinds of problem sets, but this one in particular, there are diplomatic solutions that could be at hand if the right actors kind of align their interests and push forward on it. So I think that's an important.
Declan, I'm happy you mentioned diplomatic efforts. Now, one of the decisions taken in the aftermath of the recent attacks by M23 by the government in Kinshasa was the declaration that M23 rebels as a terrorist group and their exclusion from the Nairobi peace talks. But if you talk about diplomacy, they're excluding them. So what is the significance of this move on the peace process? Because they're saying we're not going to talk to you anymore.
Yeah, look, it does seem like M23 occupies a unique space within that framework that you're talking about. And this is also about geopolitics as well. The United States has been highly involved. They've sent missions to Eastern Congo to try to understand those dynamics. And are coming out with their own kinds of policies and guidance, and so that's really important to mention as well. But regardless whether they're being involved in these particular peace talks or not, given the kind of preponderance of evidence that M23 is being advanced by, according to UN reports, either at one point Uganda and Rwanda, or whether Rwanda is involved today. that really would tell us, if that's true, that that to minimize or to eliminate this threat of M23, that relations between Kinshasa and Kigali must improve. And so there's a lot of different ways to look at it from that diplomatic lens. And M23, I think, is an example where through diplomacy that threat can be reduced or eliminated.
Okay, thank you, Declan. Now let me bring back Kambali. Kambali, the last few days have seen several efforts, regional efforts to de-escalate tensions between Kigali and Kinshasa. President Macky Sall, who is the African Union chairperson, spoke to Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi and his Rwandan counterpart, Paul Kagame, following mediation efforts by Angolan President João Lourenço. The DRC has agreed to release the 2 Rwandan soldiers. You said that earlier. Is this a welcome development or sign of weakness on President Tshisekedi's part?
Definitely is being interpreted by the Congolese people as a sign of weakness, because you have to look at the situation of the Rwandan soldiers.
Okay, I think
these soldiers on Congolese soil. So that it sends mixed messages by the Congolese president to what is happening. But we have to look at the situation of M23 in a greater context. Right? Who are the M23 soldiers? I was seeing some of the slides that you were passing, and I noticed you had the picture of Makenga, a former commander of the M23, who has arrest warrants in DRC. There are many M23 commanders who are wanted in DRC, from Laurent Kunda to Makenga and many others. Before M23, they were known as CNDP. Before CNDP, they were known as RCD. Before RCD, they were known as AFDL. The commanders have participated in the invasions of DRC in 1996, in 1998, and have continued to operate in proxy rebel militias that changes name. So the name M23 blurs who these rebel forces are. We know that they are a proxy of Rwanda. As long as diplomatic pressure is not put on Rwanda and Uganda to stop supporting proxy rebel militia groups, we will have symptomatic approach. What do I mean by that? Going to a peace negotiation with the rebels, asking them to put down the guns, and asking them also to be integrated into a functioning army, and hoping that because they put down the guns today, and they are now in the Congolese army, tomorrow they're not gonna do any crime. And historically, for the past 2 decades, we've seen that this does not work. But what do we believe works? Justice works. As long as we are not putting justice at the forefront of peace in DRC, we will only have symptomatic approach. We must hold perpetrators of violence in DRC accountable, no matter who they are. If they are Congolese, they should be held to account. If they are neighboring countries, they should be held to account. If we don't talk about justice and we're not holding perpetrators of violence accountable, it's only a matter of time, a few years, in the case of M23, a decade later, there will be a resurgence of violence again.
Thank you, Kambali. Now, Declan, after a recent meeting with Kinshasa's top diplomats, United States Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has called for a diplomatic solution to the impasse. And my question to you is, what role can the United States play in ending the cycle of violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo? And it's also instructive to note that the United States has a law that those found guilty of destabilizing the Congo should not be getting any funds. Rwanda is being funded to the tune of billions. And I'm not saying this because I don't have evidence. I'm saying this because of the United Nations mapping report. It did clearly say that there's serious interference from Rwanda and Uganda, and also the International Criminal Court of Justice has awarded reparations to the Congo, saying that Uganda should pay reparations for its looting and incursions into the DRC. So does the US have the political will to end this violence by clamping down on those that are prolonging it and also participating in it?
So I think that the U.S. position on Africa is oftentimes piecemeal, and definitely when you start looking at its interests out of DRC, and then we'll say EAC countries, particularly Rwanda, the U.S. does maintain an interest in these countries, which it wouldn't necessarily maintain as strong of an interest in other countries across the continent. But those that we're discussing about here, the U.S. does have an interest and does maintain fairly robust relations, certainly compared to other countries. I think that's where DC is coming from when they're saying that this really needs to be a diplomatic solution. They recognize that that the Great Lakes region broadly is quite incendiary, and the worst conflicts that we've seen on the continent, particularly within our lifetime, has been in all of these countries we're talking about, whether it was the 1994 genocide or the massacres that we would have seen in the 70s and 80s in Burundi, the succession of military dictatorships out of Uganda. The US, more than anything, in terms of its interest, is looking for stability. And so when we start having these kind of warring parties between Kinshasa and Kigali, this is when the US starts to kind of get concerned. Because that would be that would suddenly kind of rise to the top of the diplomatic agenda from the United States, you start seeing contradictions within its policy. So you pointed out a really good one, which is Blinken and the US State Department have said, look, if people are involved in trying to destabilize DRC, then we're going to make sure that there are financial repercussions on you. And yet, you know, if the UN investigations are to be deemed credible, and I think by and large they are, you know, Rwanda is not being punished. So this is the problem set that is being faced with, and contradictions come from it.
Okay, thank you, Declan. And we'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be looking at solutions to this violence in the DRC and how do we get lasting peace in Central Africa. Do stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. Hello, thanks for joining us again. This is Secure the Continent. We're discussing M23 rebels renewing their fighting in eastern DRC as the conflict there threatens regional stability. And I still have here with me Kambale Museveni and Declan Galvin to discuss this issue. Now, coming to you, Kambale, incursions and the takeover of Goma by M23 rebels 9 years ago led to the formation of the government of the International Conference on the Great Lakes Region, ICGLR, as well as the South Africa signed Peace, Security and Cooperation Framework for the Democratic Republic of Congo and the region. How instrumental has this been in bringing about lasting peace in the eastern DRC? And what's, in your opinion, what's your assessment of the ICGLR and the Nairobi conclave political process?
I think if we're speaking specifically around the formation of the Force of Intervention Brigade, the military force created with Tanzania forces and South Africans who participated in stopping the M23, I think it was a step in the right direction. And this is not the first time that regional leaders have come to support the DRC. If you remember, the peace negotiation of 2002 was also, in some shape and form, had influence of African countries, specifically SADC countries, saying that we need peace and stability in DRC. At the time, it was Thabo Mbeki who was very influential for that. We do need an African solution to the DRC problem, and the action by African countries, specifically Tanzania and South Africa at the time, was very helpful to stop M23. But what did they engage? I mean, they were very clear that they were not just dealing with the M23. They knew that on a diplomatic front, they needed to put pressure on Kigali, and also show that they were willing to send their soldiers on the ground for that. Today, as we're looking at the situation again of the M23, we're seeing a much different response than in 2012. We're not seeing the leadership that we saw of Tanzania in 2012 being shown again now. We're seeing Macky Sall more as the head of the African Union, presenting it as we need to de-escalate the situation and find the diplomatic solutions. But think about this situation. For over 2 decades, people have been displaced. Right? We have over close to 2 million people internally displaced in the DRC. We've had over 6 million Congolese who have died in the conflict. I'm not sure what type of de-escalation we are seeking when we know exactly what is happening. And I also want to pick up on one point that's very important, because before we went on break, you spoke about the U.S. law, Public Law 109456, that gives the U.S. Secretary of State power to withhold aid to any nation destabilizing the Congo. It's a very important point. I mean, Congolese, the international community, people who support the Congolese people, they're not seeking some type of moral right from the U.S. or their sympathy, saying that please help the Congolese people. It's not that, right? We are actually saying that there is actually a law. And the law says that if there is evidence that a country or persons are destabilizing the DRC, the United States will take its taxpayers' money and start supporting the nation. Right? So if it's not being enforced, logically, it means that the law is being broken. So if the law is being broken, it means that at the international level, the US level, the US is breaking the law. So if the US is breaking the law, it's actually creating the image that we also cannot work for justice. This will reflect in the region. Because the regional leaders will say, well, look at the United States. They're not even enforcing their own law.
How do you want to hold us accountable? Yeah.
Exactly. So at the regional level, if the regional countries are not holding the perpetrator of violence accountable, the rebels in the Congo are going to say, well, in the region, there is lawlessness, and no one is holding anyone accountable. So I can have my turf where I take the people in the area, force them to extract the minerals, abuse them, because there is no accountability. And now on the Congolese side, if the Congolese government sees that at the regional level, at the continental level, and the international level, there is no accountability, how will the Congolese government behave? So as long as there is no accountability, and again, as I mentioned before, it's not a question of a moral compass. It's actually US law. The United States is breaking its own law, where we are seeing the actions in Ukraine, that if there is political will, they can do things. But when it comes to the DRC, it's not. And we can speculate about why they are doing that. I'm very clear that the US is benefiting from the destabilization of DRC. It has allowed for Congo's resources to live at a very cheap cost. We've had numerous UN reports showing how the illicit trade routes of Congo's minerals find its way in Kampala, in Kigali, and out in the international market. So as long as Congo is unstable, Congo's resources will be pilfered. And unfortunately, the US is playing a negative role by not enforcing its own law.
Thank you, Kambali. Now, let me bring in Declan, talking about African solutions to African problems. Now, volatile for years, relations amongst the Great Lakes neighbors had begun to improve in recent months. In January, President Paul Kagame and Yoweri Museveni, Uganda's president, were inching towards rapprochement after a 3-year stalemate. I mean, even President Kagame visited Uganda for General Muhoozi Kainerugaba's birthday celebrations. The region's two heavyweights had fallen out amidst a slew of mutual recriminations, with each accusing the other of backing rebels operating from the eastern DRC. Now, Declan, what is the significance of this rapprochement to peace in the DRC?
So look, I think that there's several things at play, and it's not just about Congo. And in fact, oftentimes when we're talking about DRC, it's rarely about DRC. It's mostly about the interests of Congo's neighbors and others. So if we look at these developments through the lens of Uganda is going to at some point have a succession, right? Yoweri Museveni at some point will not be president. Maybe that will happen because he ages out or because he loses the election. And there's a lot of talk within Uganda about managing a transition. Having neighbors friendly to however a transition is managed is going to be really important. So that's also part of the reality on why these two countries are starting to engage more. The second one, which I spoke about earlier in the show, is there's a lot of discussion and a lot of infrastructure development, or at least prospective infrastructure development that's going to happen in Eastern DRC, and that is going to ideally benefit all countries in the greater kind of EAC region. Those are some of the justifications for why they would begin having more collegial relations than what we've been seeing in years past.
And it's the DRC's recent membership of the East African Community. Would it have any effects on the security on the ground? Because you can't do business if a place is not safe.
Sure. Look, so this is a significant issue, and it goes back to how people, whether it's the United States or other countries, choose to even deal with Rwanda. I mean, there are a lot of really bad options, and I think that the importance of this regional diplomacy and other large countries like the United States being involved is to find the least bad option in order to minimize displacement, in order to minimize and eliminate some of these rebel groups, demobilize and disarm other groups, and try to make sure that the region, particularly DRC, is secure so that those resources can be exploited to the benefit of Congo and not through illicit trade and smuggling networks, which is really more of the status quo now.
Thank you, Declan. Now, Kambali, the 23-year-old, look, we've talked about diplomatic efforts, but I mean, it's been going on for, there's bandied around rules like de-escalate, let's solve this through diplomacy. But they've also attempted to use military solutions to deal with this problem in the DRC. Now, the 23-year-old United Nations Organization's Stabilization Mission in the DRC, MONUSCO, was charged with monitoring the peace deals that ended the 1998 to 2003 war with an annual budget of nearly $1.4 billion, the highest in the world, and some 19,000 troops. MONUSCO is the largest United Nations peacekeeping mission in the world. You've seen Congolese protests against it. They have not been able to stop this violence. Why is the Congolese government and the United Nations struggling to contain the violence? MONUSCO has been in the DRC for 23 years, and yet there seems to be no peace in sight.
I mean, initially, what the UN diplomats will say is that the MONUSCO does not have a strong mandate to engage rebel groups in DRC. First they were just there for peace and stabilization. They did not have the mandate to enforce peace. It's no longer the case because the mandate of MONUSCO has changed to Chapter 7, which means that now they have a mandate beyond just keeping peace. They can actually enforce peace by getting the commanders to actually engage. The frustration of the Congolese population with the UN forces has been that in many places where massacres have taken place, you will have the UN forces a few kilometers away, literally hearing the people screaming as they're being hacked and killed, and the soldiers will not move to come to the rescue of the people. And it has happened many times.
Even with this Chapter 7 mandate?
Yes. I mean, let's just look at, even in the midst of the M23 uprising just this past weekend, there were massacres that took place in North Kivu, near the Beni area, where the massacres were attributed to the M23. To the ADF rebel group. So the people will always be frustrated because they're not understanding how do we have these soldiers and we're being attacked? So the part of the Congolese, they want them to be gone. The part of the Congolese government, while they say that they want the forces to be gone, every year they support the renewal of the UN forces. And depending also on who else you speak to, they will say that if the UN forces were not there, the situation will be worse. We can look at even the attacks of the M23. If the Congolese army did not have the backing of the UN forces, they could have had a hard time fighting the M23. But I will quote General Kamhert, who is a former UN commander of the UN mission at the UN mission in the DRC. He was there when it was MONUC. Patrick Kamhert has always said that we can use military power to stop rebel militia, but it cannot stop the situation in the Congo. The situation in the Congo is a political problem. And as long as it's not being referenced properly, it's not going to stop. So within the UN framework, what can stop politically the situation in the Congo? We have the Security Council members, two specific ones, the United States and the United Kingdom. They are at the UN Security Council. They are the one who decides and engage more on how UN peacekeepers will move. I mean, of course, China also has some way to that. But what many analysts have seen is that as long as there is no political will on the part of the UK and the US to engage constructively and diplomatically and politically to put pressure on the negative forces outside of the Congo that we have clearly named, we will still have the soldiers wondering, should they attack M23 soldiers who are running across the Rwandan borders? This happened this month, right? The M23 rebels actually crossed over. Even historically, some of the commanders right now are still living in Uganda and some are in Rwanda. I mean, Makenga is in Uganda. The former spokesperson of the M23, Bertrand Bisimwa, actually has a house in Kampala. No one is disturbing them.
And there are warrants of arrest by the Congolese government on some of these combatants.
Exactly. So the question still becomes, at the international level, there needs to be action. But it has happened before. The reason why M23 was defeated in 2012, beyond the military actions, the diplomatic pressure on Rwanda was tremendous. The United States withheld aid. Scandinavian country withheld aid to Rwanda. And it became almost as a ripple effect. Even the African Development Bank withheld funding to Rwanda. So as Rwanda stopped losing money, it became clear that it needs to stop supporting the M23. So we know what works, right? Diplomatic effort, strong diplomatic effort of withholding financial aid to nations destabilizing the DRC has proven to have fruit. But at this time, as we are looking at it, it's not being used. And that's what we are calling for. We need to put the same type of pressure. But in the end, if we have to go back to the reality of the people are very frustrated. I mean, the escalation of the situation with Rwanda has gone to the point where Congolese want to take the matters into their own hands. If you just watch the videos of the protest yesterday, Congolese at the Rwandan border broke the border barrier and crossed into Rwanda, right? Ordinary Congolese citizens without weapons, very frustrated, brought into another country to say that we are going to send a message.
It just shows the level of frustration and how much this has reached a boiling point. Now, Declan, still talking about the United Nations, the UN and key regional international partners have unanimously called, following the aftermath of this clashes with M23, they've unanimously called for the M23 to lay down the weapons and join the peace process and disarming and demobilizing combatants. How does the United Nations move beyond mere words to concrete actions? What do they need to do to bring about sustainable peace to the DRC?
So look, that is the big question, right? And it's a question that has been asked for decades. So there's no easy answer. But if we look at it through this one example, this prism of M23, there needs to be just what my colleague has said. There needs to be mounting an enormous pressure with a disincentive scheme on people who are enabling or empowering that group. The other part of this conversation, and one that I don't think should be lost, is there needs to be deeper and more transparent accountability within Congolese authorities, whether that's military, political, or otherwise. Those two verticals are going to be really essential in order to have some kind of sustainable peace and security moving forward.
Thank you, Declan. Now, just before we wrap things up, Kambali, what are the steps that are needed to be taken to avoid further escalation of the situation that we've seen now?
I think the rhetorics on both sides need to stop. I think that I'm looking at it more from the reality on the ground. The reports I'm getting is worrisome. The response of the Rwandan government to the evidence presented is quite arrogant. They should actually look into the situation about how did the two Rwandan soldiers end up in DRC 20 kilometers away from Rwanda and hold whoever is responsible within the Rwandan army accountable to that. On the Congolese part, what the Congolese people are actually calling for is they're very surprised. You see, for example, we are all talking about the situation in the Congo. Since this has happened, there has been no message, no information, or no public communique from the president of the Congo. Not one. There has been every message from the Minister of Communication, the military, and so on.
But,
so
but that, they work for the president, so isn't that enough?
Not at all. When your country is attacked, you want the commander-in-chief to speak to the population. You want him to go on TV and say, this is the situation that is taking place. I mean, I'm definitely not a supporter of Joseph Kabila, the former president of the DRC. But during the M23 uprising, he actually went on TV and clearly stated that Congo was being invaded by outside forces. He didn't go as far as saying Rwanda, right? But he had a speech to the Congolese population. This allows the population to manage some of the anger, because the anger has been building up for almost 2 weeks now, that we are not hearing from our president, we're hearing from everyone else. He is the commander-in-chief. He should speak to the nation. So that's one of the calls from the people. And I like Mr. Gavin's point about holding Congolese commanders in that vertical also accountable, is because within the Congolese army, one of the challenges that we've had is that some of the commanders have collaborated with rebel militias, but many of them are still there. You know, the Mundos are there. There is one that is called Tango 4. That's his nickname, who's never been held accountable, even after many reports of him selling weapons to rebel militia. So there is a local, internal accountability that needs to be had in DRC, but in the bigger picture, because of the weakness of Congo's institution, because of the different challenges that we may have, adding to that an external force supporting rebel militias that makes it even much tougher. But the most important out of all of this, which I always insist on, as long as we are not trying the crimes that's taking place, it will always be an open door for violence in DRC.
Once justice isn't served. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being a part of the program. Declan Gavin and Kambali Musevuli, I do appreciate your insights and contributions to the program. Thanks for joining. Now, on the surface, Great Lakes countries patching up their differences, yet military operations by Burundi and Uganda in the eastern DRC, combined with continued rebel activity, could reignite historical antagonism between neighbors and further destabilize the DRC. President Felix Tshisekedi should intensify efforts to dissuade Rwanda from deploying forces across the border, and also organize fresh talks with neighboring countries to rethink further military action and develop a comprehensive plan for negotiations with armed groups. Remember to join me next week on Secure the Continent. I'm Benga Aborowa. Thanks for being a part of the program.